Attention, agents of Spectre. There is no need to adjust your televisions. You are not seeing double. Okay, actually you are. Just because I double dipped with Double or Nothing. And that's what we're talking about today. Hey guys, welcome back to the Bond Report. My name is Chris, aka the Bearded Blofeld. And today we're doing another great book club review. And this time it's Kim Sherwood's first crack at a James Bond adventure. But did she deliver? I'm joined today by four well-known voices within the Bond community. So let me introduce my guests. So today, guys, I am joined by four panelists, well-known voices in the Bond community. I have Elma Valerio, I have Terrance Layhew, I have David Lowbridge-Ellis, and I have the one and only Roland Hulme. So guys, thank you all for being here so much. I really appreciate this.
Pleasure.
Thank you for having us.
Cheers.
All right. And so let's go ahead and do that. Everybody got their drinks up? Cheers, guys. Absolutely.
Cheers.
Whatever you got to get through. Wonderful. So my first guest today is going to be Elma Valerio, featured fashion designer of Elma Lingerie, co-creator of the Dressing to Kill podcast. Elma, welcome today.
Hi, thank you so much for having me. Dressed to
Not a
Kill.
problem.
I just updated
Dressed-
my Zoom name, so it's there. You can see it now.
Okay,
But
I
yes,
apologize.
I'm-
Dressed to Kill.
No worries. Super excited to be here. Thank you so much.
Absolutely. It's a pleasure to have you. So I kind of wanted to focus with you. There was a different, because I know you have a very different connection with the Bond community. And being an artist yourself, I'm sure that you get inspiration, from many different things and influences that come in and kind of, influence your creative process. Having said that, tell us what you thought about, the way Kim Sherwood painted with words to kind of describe these characters, their styles, and the environments that we kind of get taken off to.
Oh, I love that you asked me that question because I thought she did a great job with putting all the details of like painting the picture, like you said, seeing the visual of what this person is wearing, what they look like, what type of, vibe they have. And I loved the little things like, a lot of little details about the vintage Vivienne Westwood black velvet dress and like little hints and nods where it's like, that she's a fashion lover, the person who's writing it, because vintage black velvet Vivienne Westwood is very specific. And you kind of get a certain idea of what a person that would wear that in, today would be like. But I thought that there could have been a little bit more, a little bit more like psychology that was kind of described around these choices for why people were wearing these things. Like, okay, someone might be wearing Awabaki shoes, but why? Because that's such a specific detail, and like when as I was reading it, I got visuals of a lot of the other Bond movies, as I was, trying to put some imagine it together. So I imagined that, the scene in Casino Royale when they meet on the train, when Bond and Vesper meet on the train for the first time, and they kind of say their opinions or what they see, what they're picking up on what the person is wearing. And I wanted a little bit more of that, like by the cut of your suit, you went to Oxford or wherever. Whereas like a little bit more of that, the sizing up of someone, kind of guessing like their background from what they're wearing. I wanted to feel a little bit more of that, but I really loved all the little details of the specificity of the fashion choices that they were, choosing to wear. So yeah, I just wish there was a little bit more about like reasoning for it.
And that makes sense. I mean, guys, did you have any take on this as well?
I think it's really difficult going into any Bond novel, isn't it? Because we all have our obsessions with Bond. And we all focus on particular things. So I very rarely focus on the clothing. So I'm always fascinated to hear from people who are really interested in the clothing side of things, because it's a part of Bond that I don't actually notice that much. He says sort of wearing a vaguely Thunderball-esque pink shirt. So I don't. It's not the kind of elements that I know what you're saying though. Elma, in the sense that, so I go into a Bond novel always looking for the drinks, for instance, rather than the clothes. and I've said this to Kim myself, I'm like, you have Moneypenny drink a really interesting cocktail, and there's some other bits and pieces in there as well, but it's not the most booze heavy Bond book. But I think if you were to include detail around every single aspect of everything everyone loves about Bond, I think you'd end up with a Bond book there's about 800, 900 pages every time. That's my take on it anyway.
For sure.
She does paint some really interesting pictures in this book. I love the chapter where she's basically bouncing from location to location,
Yeah.
and she has to give you the location at the top because she's bouncing so quick. And I thought that was a really unique way to bounce the action through a chapter like that.
I think Ian Fleming was a master of using popular brands and clothing choices and things to tell you about characters without needing to tell you about characters. And I think that, and when I write romance books, like, I got one piece of advice a writer told me is, listen, you know how guys, you can't just say it's a gun in a story. You have to say it's a Colt 1911 45 caliber because men are interested in that. If you're writing a story with female characters, and you can't just say her handbag, you have to have more information like that, because a woman who has a Michael Kors handbag has a very different agenda to one who has a Louis Vuitton handbag. And so I enjoy those elements. I think they're very much part of Fleming. And I mean, I think absolutely Kim like focused in and tried to do exactly the same thing. I will say that there are a lot of references to Bond films within the choices that the characters make, which I loved because they're like Easter eggs. But I think that's a bit of an indulgence, because in some ways, like, you think of the person, why would they necessarily have that, you know, that particular watch or something, apart from having a nice little Easter egg for Bond fans like us. But yeah, fashion, these little choices, what you wear, what you drink, what car you drive, what gun you carry, all these things, I think are fascinating ways to give a lot of background to a character without having to write it.
So, Roland, you are actually my next question in line, sir.
Ooh.
So I am going to come for you. You ready?
No pressure.
You ready? All right. All right. So, Roland, you actually made a wonderful comparison and referred to other more recent Bond authors as meat and potatoes during a conversation. Bond novels, canon, but referred to Kim Sherwood as sushi. Can you explain to everyone kind of like what you meant by that, and what wine would pair best with a Sherwood roll?
Oh, that's interesting. Well, it would be sake, served at the correct temperature, of course.
Of course.
I think it's interesting because Charlie Higson, when he wrote On His Majesty's Secret Service, he was interviewed, and he said, writing a Bond story isn't hard because it's a formula. You have the exciting opening scene, you have the briefing with M, you have the getting the gadget from Q, you have the tense, awkward meeting with a villain where they pretend civility to each other, then you have Bond being found out and captured, and it's almost like a shopping list of things you need to tick, which is an immensely satisfying thing. And when you have a really good writer do it, it can be really, really satisfying. And I think Raymond Benson and Sebastian Faulks and Anthony Horowitz was just brilliant at it. Charlie Higson's book was fantastic. Kim was doing something completely different, and I kind of like that. I think there was a huge amount of pressure on her. And this is the second book she's ever written to be a Bond book. I think it's really interesting to not have Bond as the main character, to have him removed from it. But this was a very different thing. This isn't a traditional Bond book, because instead of following one familiar character, you're being introduced to 3 different characters who orbit Bond. And I think whatever happens, people reading this book are going to have to go into territory that is unfamiliar to a Bond fan. So I think if you want your classic Bond read, you read Charlie Higson's, because it is like your meat and potatoes. You want to read Bond, this is exactly what you expect from Bond, whereas Double or Nothing is more of an experiment and more going into other places. So it's not going to be for everyone. But then again, the people it is for, it's really going to be for. And so, yeah, I think it is a case of like your meat and potatoes, or let's try sushi. I think the Moneypenny Diaries and Young Bonds, they were different types of food. And so I think, Double or Nothing has a very specific place within the Bond library that it occupies. And it's just a different flavor of Bond. But that's the beauty of being able to do it.
That's what I loved when I heard your explanation of this before. And that's why I brought this into the fold today. I wanted people to who are looking at reading this book or considering reading this book, or maybe they read this book and it didn't touch them in a certain way. I wanted them to kind of take a look at it from that different perspective and understand that that's not what this is. It's not the it's not the normal formula. It's not. It was designed to be exactly the opposite from the normal formula.
Baja? I haven't got a thing at Baja.
And that, to me, was the joy behind it, because I was like, finally, we are branching out. We are going in a different direction. The adventure is still there. The connection is still there, but we are literally orbiting Bond at this point. We are not focused on him. Terrance, what did you kind of have to say about that?
So what I love about that illustration Roland used is that it really does feel like a taste flavor preference in a lot of ways. And the thing that worked the most for me in this book was the Dryden storyline, which is the most like a conventional Bond story, told in an excellent way. And I think that that's the thing that I thought was most interesting, is all the characters, he's the one I connected to the most. And I wonder how much of that is because that structure that we have from the Bond stories is so powerful. It works so well that despite the fact Dryden isn't introduced until, like, I don't know, chapter 5, 6, something like that. It's a good ways into the book, which usually means he's not that primary person that you're going to connect with the most. But because of the way his mission kind of was organized, I connected with him more than the rest of the characters in the book.
I personally, he wasn't my direct connection. I was more of a Hardwood connection. She was my driving force to the whole book. I loved the other characters, but Joanna Hardwood was, like, to me, she felt like she was more the star of the show. But I completely understand why you would think Dryden.
Well, here's the thing I thought was interesting. I recently did an interview with a guy named Matt Bird, wrote a great book called The Secrets of Character. And he basically starts the book saying, you know what, when you write a book, you can tell the audience as much as you want, this is your main character, but people will choose who their hero in the story is. It doesn't matter if it's even the villain sometimes. People will choose, when they read a book, whoever that person that they believe can invest in the most is the one they'll connect with.
Very true. Okay. David, coming to you next, sir.
Good stuff.
David Lowbridge-Ellis. So obviously you have a background in teaching. You're definitely a social media personality yourself. You know, you have a presence out there. You have worked with Kim on several occasions. We've got countless images of you guys hanging out. When Kim was announced as the author, you actually said that your money was on her for diversity. So my question to you.
Go for it.
My question to you was, what made you feel that Kim was the one to bring this element to the forefront of the Bond franchise? And two-part, what were your thoughts on the execution and the integration of Dryden in the final product?
Wow. Okay. So they're two massive questions. I'll try to be succinct. So,
Fair enough.
I mean, I'd read, as soon as she was announced, I read Testament, her first novel.
Yes.
And there are some cheeky Bond references in that novel.
Oh yeah.
Scattered throughout. It's a very, very different novel to a Bond novel. It's not an easy read in the sense of it being, you know, it's very well written, but it's also very emotionally intense. It deals with the Holocaust. It's really intense, and and I think it was that made me think, okay, she'll be prepared to go there. What I'm really interested in hearing, and I actually haven't done any research on this myself, is how people's reactions to this book differs if they're more familiar with the film Bond or the literary Bond. Now, I love both. If I had to choose one of the two, I'd probably go with literary Bond, to be perfectly honest. But Fleming was constantly innovating stylistically, and going back to what we were talking about, just about, you know, this being kind of meat and potatoes or sushi, Fleming was quite restless in terms of his stylistic innovations. So for me, this wasn't so much of a kind of culture shock as I imagine it is people who are coming to it more of a kind of a Bond movie mindset. So I thought that she would be prepared to mix things up quite a bit, just preemptive. And this is before I even messaged Kim, before I got to know Kim, before I commented on any of her posts. We're talking probably about 18 months ago. But I thought, just based on her first book, I thought this would be someone who would be prepared. And I was going out on a limb, and lots of podcasts at the time, I was saying, I reckon Kim Sherwood will be finally the person who is going to broaden the range of 00 agents and all the rest of it. And I've never been happier to be right, to be perfectly honest. And you know, if we're talking about Dryden specifically, Dryden is my connective kind of point to this book, probably more than the others. I love Johanna. Absolutely, I love Johanna. I love Johanna the second time I read the book, certainly more than the first time I read the book. I'm not sure if we're going into spoiler territory here, but there's a reason why you might not want to kind of emotionally invest with Joanna the first time, and then second time maybe you will. I'm just gonna leave that there. But with Dryden, it did mean an awful lot to me, and I don't mean this in a tick box way in any way. It meant so much to me to have a gay 00 in a James Bond story. You know, something I've been waiting essentially 35 years for, you know, and I've been waiting for someone to deliver that. If Bond is going to survive, it needs to innovate. And Fleming always understood that. Eon have always understood that. Sometimes they've kind of innovated more than at other times. I think the age that we're in now, people expect to see themselves represented in their stories. And if we really make sure that Bond survives in decades to come, I think it's really important that people do see more of themselves.
So do you think this was a solid execution of that achievement?
I've read so much queer fiction, like, you know, over the years, literally hundreds of books written about queer characters, and, you know, not exactly a spoiler alert, most of them die at the end or live miserable lives, and it's definitely a recurring theme. And again, I don't want to go too much near spoiler territory in case people haven't read Double or Nothing, but
Right.
I think it's fairly safe to say Dryden survives until the next book. If you've heard anything about A Spy Like Me, the follow-on, you know Dryden is still in that story. Not everyone survives Double or Nothing, and there are some brave choices there. But it's not just that the fact that Dryden actually lives through the story, for me, is a perfect representation of a gay character. And that's really difficult because gay people are very different from one another. And trying to kind of make it work for everyone is really difficult. And I can't say that it necessarily would work for everybody. I can't imagine it wouldn't. But for me, she manages to navigate all the traditional pitfalls of presenting a gay male character with absolute aplomb.
She's very good at writing about characters who are very different to her, but in a meaningful way. I mean, I read Testament, and I had tears streaming down my eyes at the end of it because it was a relationship between two brothers. And it reminded me of my relationship with my brother who's passed away. And I was just thinking, you know, Kim is a young woman, and she's written this incredibly authentic, resonant relationship between two brothers that, you know, it's such a shows such empathy to be able to get into the head of the characters like that. And everything you said there, it seems again to maybe highlight one of Kim's real strengths as a writer, is the ability to write about people who are different from her in a way that shows real empathy and understanding for who they are and makes them seem like real people.
Yeah, and that's where I thought it was a successful integration, because it wasn't just about that one element. And I know a lot of people turned away from this book because of that element. And I feel like that's a whole nother conversation we could have a whole nother video on. But at the end of the day, I loved the integration. I thought it worked well. I thought it was a seamless element within the book where she was really kind of exploring new territory for this community, but it's not new territory for the community, for the spy community. It was common practice. It was something that was heavily prevalent because it was almost another layer of stealth in a way, because a lot of people weren't expecting, you know, someone like that to be in that line of work. And come to find out, no, that was actually a pretty big element.
To quote Fleming in From Russia with Love, which is the one I'm rereading at the moment, actually, because my husband's reading, he's working his way through the Fleming books. That's how much he loves me. But you know, to quote Fleming in From Russia with Love, homosexuals are the worst security risk there is. That's actually not Fleming. That's a character in Fleming, which he then lampoons, because Bond is like, well, not all homosexuals are bad, but there is that he has a character in there represent that viewpoint of the late 1950s, because in 50s Britain, homosexuals were the worst security risk you could have, because it was illegal to be gay, and so they could be very easily blackmailed by the KGB. So we've gone from gay people being a security risk to gay people being the people who save the day in Double or Nothing, which I think is hugely important.
They had some big scandals in the 50s and 60s as well, didn't they? Of people in the intelligence community who were forced to defect because of that. And it was such a public recognition. In the 70s, they used to talk about Roger Moore as like finally a spy who actually likes women, because it was like a joke back then.
British intelligence was rife with, you know, that's what John le Carré writes about that all the time. So many, I don't think there's a John le Carré book where there isn't at least a queer coded character. If not, you know, Tinker Tailor Soldier Spy, there's several gay characters, and then, you know, spoiler alert, but you know, the main traitor in that does some of what he does because he's in love with a man. So he was reflecting. So in a sense, Bond was sort of almost behind the times in a way, but Fleming was kind of trying to catch up.
Yeah, I thought she did a great job. I think, you know, when you talk about her being the one to bring in diversity to this, she did that in so many ways. And I guess you kind of need the space to have all these other double O's to be able to explore that. Like you can't, you know, the Bond movies and books, excuse me, are usually about him. So how can we spend the time to really get into that? And I really like how she laid down the foundations for all the other, you know, the double O's, which we always, I feel like I come from watching the movies a lot more than reading the books. I read some of the Fleming books, but this is my first continuation novel that I read. So I liked that we always wanted to get a little peek into, you know, the other double O's, when in the movies you only see them all together in the Thunderball scene, or, you know, you hear about them in passing here and there. So I loved that she was able to bring a lot more different characters and backgrounds into this.
I felt like it added a layer of depth to the MI6 agency, the Scooby-Doo gang, if you will. It just added that whole layer of depth that we've been missing for so long. To me, this felt like so long coming, like just so long. This franchise could have done a spinoff, and there were talks of, you know, spinoff movies, and this Bond girl was going to get her own movie, and that Bond girl, but it, not even so much just the Bond girls, the entire cast expanding. What does Q become in this book? And I am going to go ahead and give that spoiler away for people on this video. So heads up, if you haven't read the book, this is a spoiler for the book. Q being not a person, Q is that supercomputer that has the Q branch around him. That I thought was genius, for the sheer fact that it goes back to, it's all about teamwork. We are a team. I mean, Terrance, what did you think about that? Was that something that connected with you?
So I am the rugged individualistic American here who doesn't like stories where people are teams and teamwork. I want to see one lone hero on his own fighting against the forces of darkness. I mean, that's the exaggeration. But the truth is, the Scooby-Doo gang elements are usually the things that fall flattest for me in the films. So making that the larger picture of the book is one of the things that just didn't work for me. It didn't click, because it felt like we were trying to bounce so much around all of the other characters that it felt like we didn't have enough driving force towards one singular thing to move the velocity of the story along. It just felt like anytime we were getting momentum, we switch to something else, and then the pace just slows down to a crawl. That was my personal experience reading it. Again, it's also, like Roland said, it's a matter of taste and preference. And I prefer that one layer that we're moving through. And also, like, honestly, I don't like supercomputers.
Okay.
As a plot device.
Fair enough. Fair enough. Well, that's going to bring me into my direct question for you then, Terrance. So let's go ahead and kick this one off, because I know that, as we've talked, this book was not well received by everyone, obviously.
Mm-hmm.
Having said that, how did the book compare to your expectations, before you started reading it? And what did you hope to find that the book really didn't deliver for you?
So I think that what the book did a fantastic job at doing, and as everyone has said, the thing that is most prevalent about this book is the sheer ambition of it. I think that, like Icarus, that is its flaw for me, is that there's trying to do too much rather than telling a simple story and letting the world open up through telling the story. Instead, a lot of the book is about building this world. Let's crack it open, this large explosion. We have everything going on. And that just doesn't work for my taste to try this. It reminds me of the Dark Universe in the Mummy movie, where we're trying to set up this big franchise in this big world instead of focusing on the story is trying to tell. And I understand that that's part of the whole premise of this book. However, I feel like I would have resonated with it more if it had been inverted, where we're telling one story and we're building the world as we're telling the story, instead of, in this case, we built the world and we have a story happening in the midst of that.
Gotcha.
I think that's a very fair observation.
The flip side of that I had to kind of keep in mind, because I'm not going to lie, there were definitely chapters in this book where I was like, I found myself like, this is kind of droning on. When are we getting to the action? I still love the book as a whole, but I will say that I felt that she had put so much into this that there was times where I found myself going back to chapters like, wait, who was she talking about? Hold on, where am I at again? Oh, okay. And having to kind of refresh just to keep up with the pace sometimes.
Mm-hmm.
However, reading through the entire book, and I'm going to leave this one open. Actually, no, I'm going to direct this one directly at David. David, knowing that we've crammed all of this in, does this make you more excited for the next book? Because the stage is set. There's nothing else. Like, she literally got it all into this one book to basically take the next two books and blow our minds with a true story-driven and action-driven adventure.
I'm the sort of person who, when there's like okay, the best one is that we were actually talking about this earlier when we were making dinner, about the Star Wars series or a Marvel series or something like that. And Kim has made comparisons herself to the Marvel Cinematic Universe in terms of what she's doing here. If you've seen Andor, the first 3 episodes are boring as sin. And then people say it gets good by episode 4, which it does. And then there's the prison sequence, and that's really good. And then it kind of loses something, and then it gains it again by the end. I hate being that person or having people tell me, oh no, it's okay once you get to series 3, but that means I've wasted 24 hours of my life by the time I get to series 3. I'm sorry, I should be enjoying it from episode 1. Now, I'm not going to say that I wasn't mentally a little bit kind of more challenged than I usually am when I'm reading a James Bond novel, because a James Bond novel is usually pretty straightforward to read. It's not check your brain at the door stuff, but it's like, we know as Roland said earlier, we sort of know the formula. Even if Fleming innovated, it's sort of on rails sort of thing. We don't have that to grip onto with this book. And I think for the first half, there is an awful lot of setup. But for me, and I think the second half is an absolute breeze, to be perfectly honest. Once everything is set up and all the action sequences unfold, it's like the pieces are in place, the dominoes are falling. And I think the second half is an absolute breezy read. I sped through the second. I mean, I sped through it the first time anyway, but the second half in particular, I think I read the whole of the last 200 pages in one sitting. So, but the first 200 pages I read in a couple of goes because I needed time to process what was going on, which was an unusual experience for a Bond novel for me. The thing that I found, though, is that Kim is such an amazing stylist, and I'm not saying that just because I know Kim in person. Honestly, I
Sure.
promise. But she's such an amazing stylist in terms of the right. I mean, there are. I love all the continuation books. They've all got different merits, but I
Yeah.
genuinely don't think anyone is as great a prose stylist since Fleming as Kim Sherwood is, in terms of crafting of whole chapters have their own kind of structure to them, their own, like, it's almost like the chapters are short stories in themselves, and that can become like mentally quite taxing quite quickly, because it's almost like you've been told a complete story in one chapter, and then she kind of leaves that. It's like the Shrublands chapter with Johanna, which happens quite early on, is mind-blowingly brilliant in terms of how that chapter is structured, in terms of the psychological trajectory we're taken on with that chapter. And I don't think we're used to something quite that literary with Fleming. I think literary with Bond. Fleming, I think, is kind of unfairly not looked upon as a literary author still by some people. And I do think we're still due for a reassessment there, which is kind of happening in some circles, but not others. So I think Fleming's literature, I think this is literature, whatever that means, the big scare quotes coming out here, whatever that means. Not all of the Bond continuation books, as much as I enjoy them, would qualify as great pieces of writing. And I think that's the difference here. I think that the first half of the book is so well written. It's almost too well written in a sense. We're not used to reading Bond stories that are this thought-provoking. And I think probably that for me is kind of like, I think in the subsequent books, now the world is established, I think we're still going to get spectacular writing and great action and all the rest of it. But I think because we've got that world formed in our heads, I think it's going to become a bit breezier to read.
Just to hop in on that, sorry, Roland, real quick. I 100% agree with the first half being the hardest, and then it gets easier. For me, that was more like 3/4 to the last quarter. But something that I realized in the reread is I don't think it's helped by the formatting, because there's so little white space
100%
in the book.
Mm.
So it feels so dense that as I was reading it, I kept just writer brain, clip that sentence, move this here, space out apart, mentally just seeing that as it would be easier to read through if they hadn't made it so blocky in the book itself.
I think I think it's also fair to say, I mean, I think, David, I have a slightly different viewpoint at the beginning. I think the writing is very different, as you said, to how Ian Fleming wrote, to a point where it can be quite dense and blocky just on its own merits. Kim paints beautiful pictures and uses words so effectively, but within the first few pages, there is a sentence that is 61 words long. And Ian Fleming, his average sentence length was between 8 and 11 words. And it's like, it's a beautiful piece of writing. It's like a beautiful piece of writing, but I couldn't read it out loud without taking a deep breath halfway through. And I think the beginning part especially is trying to give you so much information, and it has a lot of imagery and expansion to the prose. I think maybe we know Kim is a wonderful writer. We've read Testament. We've read a Real and True Relation. I think maybe the Ian Fleming publications could have edited it a little more crisply. I don't think it's a reflection of Kim's writing. I think it's more the editing that kind of lets it down a bit in the beginning and makes it more difficult to get into. And then once you find a pace, you're right, the rest of it just goes at a cracking pace. It becomes really enjoyable to read. But it is dense in the beginning, and that's the part of a book you don't want to be dense.
Usually we have like a chapter, we have like the first what's the word I'm looking for, like you have the scene, the middle scene, and then the ending scene. And I know I'm not using the right term there, but that middle scene is usually where thank you but yeah, you have like the second act is typically where you find yourself in that lull. And Roland, and David, to piggyback on you guys, you're right, it's more the first act. And it's Terrance even found it to be the first and second act, it sounds like. So, but I get it. It's laid now, though. We've got the story. So for me, when I got done with it, as heavy as it was, because this one took me a little bit longer to read. I'm not the fastest reader in the world, but getting through it, I found myself more excited because I was like, okay, she set the stage. This is going to be great. I can't wait for the second book. And I guess that's where I kind of lean maybe to Elma. Let me ask you this. What do you think about how this entire story played out and the direction they're going with the franchise?
By the end of the book, I was like, ooh, like my eyebrows raised, and I was like, okay, I'm ready for the next thing. But I think I'm the only one that listened to it on audio because I wasn't able to get the book in time for this. I think it was going to arrive like next week. So I was like, okay, we'll do the audio. And it was very kind of difficult to keep track of what was bouncing back and, from which story we were going. Especially because I'm not able to take notes in the book. So that I did have to go back and listen a few times. But I agree with you. I feel like now that she's laid out the foundation, it was like a little bit of a trek to get through, but I'm very much looking forward to like knowing that this is a trilogy. I'm like, thank goodness. And I can see why she took the liberty to spend the first book on setting up the foundation. But I'm ready to get into the next thing. And I'm like, when's the book going to be released? But I do want to buy the book and then reread it as you guys all have, because that sounds like I'll be able to get a lot more out of it.
See, I was actually curious as I was reading the book physically how the audiobook experience was, because I binge a lot of audiobooks when I'm driving for work.
Mm-hmm.
So as I was sitting there, because my mind's having focused so intently on keeping pace with the words, I wasn't certain if the audiobook would have been easier to digest.
I also listened to it at like 1.4x speed, so the action is fast. It feels.
I thought I was the only person who did that.
Yeah, you're thrown into the book, into like certain chapters, and it's just like out with a bang, and it's really thrilling. And but that you do kind of miss some details in the long sentences when it's just kind of describing and talking. And but I thought overall it felt like it felt like you were kind of listening to a movie in terms of, because it's very flashy with visuals and the set pieces, the locations, and kind of the aesthetic of it. So I enjoyed the audiobook, and it was a great performance. So I'd recommend it if you want to just get a different perspective to both.
So guys, one more question for the group collectively. And this is kind of a selfish question, if you will, because I am a big lover of cars. What did we think about the Alpine car in this book? Did it make sense? Were the gadgets something clever? Were they kind of corny? Like, Roland, we'll start with you. What did you think about the car?
Well, I love cars. I absolutely adore cars. I love classic cars. I love the Sunbeam Alpine and stuff like that. I have to admit, I was not aware that Alpine was still producing cars. And so I hadn't really been keeping up with it. And then because of Kim's book, I got introduced to this car, and I thought it was a very sporty, nice. I liked it. And it was, I think in some ways you could run the risk of it's sort of a bit too much product placement, but in other ways, it's so nice to see like a beautiful car that people aren't familiar with featured. And I think the gadgets in it were that was like a part of the fun. That car chase in particular was like that was really felt like as Elma said, like it being watching a movie.
Terrance, what about you?
I recuse myself because I tune out anytime I hear a car described in any book, let alone in a Bond book. So
okay, fair enough. David, I see you pull the.
I've got to be honest. I'm not a car nut at all. I drive a Tesla. So as soon as James Bond starts driving an electric car, I might start taking more of an interest. Don't get me wrong. I've got models around me at the moment of the Aston Martins, the Lotus Esprit, and all that sort of stuff. I am not a car nut, though. You must be thinking, so he doesn't do the clothes, he doesn't do the cars, he doesn't do the women. What does he actually like James Bond for?
Oh, I think the cocktails and the homoeroticism are too. You've got to get a lifetime out of those.
The homoeroticism, the self-loathing, all of that stuff. If you that's probably why I love this book so much. The characters basically are like Bond, like amped up in terms of all the self-loathing. That's right. All the introspection and all that kind of stuff. It must be horrendous being a spy, being constantly having to conceal your identity and all that sort of stuff, and the kind of queer resonances are totally not lost on me there. But you know, I've just picked up the paperback edition here because the
I
Alpine
love that
actually
design.
made the
I
cover
do too.
for the paperback. And apparently, Kim says that the Alpine is partly in there because Kim doesn't actually drive herself. She can't drive. So she does that amazing action sequence. And in fact, two action sequences. You've got Howard's Alpine, and then you've got the amazing chase across the massively long bridge to Hong Kong. With Dryden, and she doesn't actually drive. So I'm like, how do you write this without being able to drive? But apparently, the managing director of Ian Fleming Publications, Corinne, is she's got an Alpine, so she kind of took some inspiration from there. But I've got to be honest, other than that, I don't have much of an interest in cars. So I'm probably the wrong person to ask again.
And I found it funny because talking with her, she said that, you know, as part of her inspiration to write about the car, she of course had to go test the car out, and she had to take a test drive with someone else. So they send her out to this track, and she gets in the car and she is being driven around this racetrack by this driver, and she can't tell the driver like why she's talking to him, why she's asking. And he's like, "Are you writing like a book or something?" She's like, "Well, no, I'm running a report." Like she has to kind of be sneaky about why she's there and everything. And I thought it was a really funny way because she's sitting here going through all the details of like the paddle shifters and what it sounds like and the torque and everything when the throttle goes down and the torque throttles, you know, pushes you to the back of the seat. So she gives all these great descriptions, and I'm like, you never drove.
But that's so Fleming, though. Fleming writes about all these things which he had no flipping idea about. Like, Fleming didn't know anything about food. He was completely clueless.
He had terrible taste in wine.
Terrible tasting wine and martinis and clothes and everything else. You know, so Fleming writes about all these things like he knows what he's talking about. And I think that's the genius of anyone who writes a Bond book. They can write, I mean, sometimes it goes a bit like, if you remember in the John Gardner books, he writes a bit kind of, if you've read those, they're a bit kind of obsessive about kind of some of the naval detail because he was in the Navy, and you're inevitably going to bring some of that experience to it. But I think if you're writing Bond, you have to pretend, you have to bluff your way through so many different fields which you don't know about, which I think is brilliant.
Yeah.
I just want to throw out there, I heard a great piece of writing advice once that I think carries so well through in this book and Fleming's work. Don't write what you know, write the emotions you know how to feel.
That's really good.
And I think that's what Kim
Terrance
Sherwood, Ian Fleming, a lot of great authors, that they've never done the things they're writing about. What makes it stellar is they know how to write about that feeling, that emotion that they have.
They're actors on pen.
Mm-hmm.
They're actors on paper. They basically act out on paper what they want to do, how they want the scene to play out. It's beautiful. Wonderful. Elma, did you have any thoughts on the vehicle itself? Are you a car nut?
I'm a low-key car girl. Grew up with a lot of that around me, but I was more drawn to Moneypenny's green Jaguar E-Type that she had converted electric.
Thank you for bringing it up.
The visual of it driving through the hills and, like, you know, Moneypenny stepping out in her ox blood brogues is a great visual, and I love that for the style points. And, you know, it's a little bit cliche, like, you know, classic car green in the British racing green and everything, but I think it would work really well on the screen, and would love to see a lot of these elements be adapted into like a TV series or something.
Oh, wonderfully. Yeah. Sometimes cliches are cliches because they just work so well. And this is one of those moments where it's just a beautiful interpretation of that. So good. I'm glad you brought that up. Now, Terrance, correct me if I'm wrong, sir, but I believe you have a question for me.
I do. So I puzzled. I thought long and hard. What is the best question to ask Chris? And this book is loaded with Bond Easter eggs. Which was the one that made you grin the widest when you read it?
Oh, my Lord. That's a great one. That is a
I
great
have
one.
one.
Ooh.
Mm.
Can I say mine?
Go ahead, Elma. Yeah.
My favorite moment was when Tiger Tanaka shows up. And the entrance of
Massive
that, I was
spoiler.
like,
Mhm.
right?
Yeah.
Oh shoot, yeah,
Spoilers,
spoilers. Or we can totally cut that if you want.
No, it's okay.
I think it was
But yeah, that
He's obviously asked me about Easter eggs, so Easter eggs are going to be a spoiler anyway. So I mean,
Yeah.
people
He was
probably should have
really
figured
made me
that much
smile.
out.
brilliant use of a supporting character from the Fleming canon.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
Yeah. And I hate to piggyback, but it is probably Tiger for me. He was such. It made me smile because I have such a connection with Yolt. Personally, it is the second I hear Nancy Sinatra,
Mhm.
I am teleported immediately. If I hear any of the music from You Only Live Twice, that's probably the soundtrack that connects me most to Bond. I don't know why. I think it's just because of the age that I was when I saw that film. It was
Mhm.
probably my second or third Bond film that I'd ever seen. And the music was so different from the Brosnan era, which were the first two films I saw, GoldenEye and Tomorrow Never Dies. Stepping back into watching Connery, somebody was like, "Oh, you got to watch, You Only Live Twice. You'll love the volcano scene, and it's got the helicopter, and Little Nelly, of course, now." But yeah, Tiger was. I saw that. I immediately was like, "Oh, I see what you did there."
Mhm.
So great question. Great question. Well, guys, we'll kind of wrap this up because I don't want us to spend all afternoon together, as much as I'm sure we all could go on and on and on about Bond all day long. I'm just going to kind of go around everybody and tell me final thoughts. Roland, let's start with you. Final thoughts. What was your overall impression of the book?
The thing about the book that made me happiest was I read it, and I'll admit it didn't resonate with me as much as with, say, the Anthony Horowitz books, because of maybe the beginning parts. The way it was written was a little more challenging. But to see David's reaction, and to see how much David loved it, and to see how enthusiastic he was about it, and how much it resonated with him, and how much it spoke to him, and then to like that, to me was like, I'm really excited about this book because, yeah, we are a big James Bond community, and I am your typical tedious middle-aged white guy. I am very well served within Bond for things that get me, and I love David. David, I think you're an awesome bloke, and it was really exciting to see you so excited about it. And then I loved him anyway as a person, and her book Testament really meant something to me. So I am 100% hashtag Team Kim.
Hashtag Team Kim Sherwood. Hashtag Team Kim Sherwood.
And I'm all for the Sherwood verse. And so, and the burden she has got in Fleming Publications. I made a video about this the other day. It said has always handed the reins to Bond to like veteran authors, and then they're like, "Oh, you've written one book. Here is the opportunity to write a book in this series, possibly the most popular literature series of all time, and you're going to have the eyes of a very intense community on you. Go nuts with it." And so I'm just the chutzpah that she has to be able to create this world and weave this world, and then to see it resonate so deeply with people like David makes me just really excited that it exists. And Elma, I think you were right about how this book sets up what happens next. And so I think A Spy Like Me is going to be a book that is going to be much easier to dive straight into.
Elma, what about you? Final thoughts. Double or nothing.
I watched the interview, or started to watch the interview with you and Kim before I got into the book to kind of see what this was about. And as I love her so much because she's truly a Bond fan. I'm like, I relate to this girl. I stopped the interview halfway so that I didn't get any more spoilers or any more details. And I was like, okay, I'm going to start the book right away. So because of her, I was so thrilled and so excited. And I think, yeah, it's great to have her perspective. And the Fleming Foundation was really daring to do something, go in a new direction with her, in this. And I feel like and hopefully it'll kind of help introduce literary Bond to other people who have not gotten into the books as much before,
Yes.
because of the way it was written or something. And so I'm really looking forward to seeing like a newer generation kind of grab onto this. She included a lot of themes that were relevant and current, and then also like the diversity and inclusivity, which is absolutely important to be represented. So I'm super looking forward to the next books, and yeah, excited. Also Team Kim, absolutely.
Terrance.
This book is immensely ambitious, and while it doesn't always hit that height for me, I am excited to see what continues to come out of this. And I'm so, again, just to jump on what everyone else has said, so excited to see Kim continue to expand this world. And it's such a great relief to see Ian Fleming Publications taking a big swing, because honestly, I would
Yes.
rather see a really ambitious project that doesn't work for me than something that's mediocre and same and safe and doesn't try continuing to move the story forward. Because again, for as much as this book doesn't work for me, it is a big swing. It is a big leap for Ian Fleming Publications, and I'm looking forward to seeing them continue to have the chutzpah.
I think, like everybody keeps saying, it's a long time coming. We needed this kind of branch off to give us something fresh, to give us something modern, to really connect with that next generation that isn't editing the original novels.
Preach, hallelujah, yes.
Amen.
My Lord. Anyway, all right, David, final thoughts.
I think Double or Nothing really breathes oxygen. Like a lot of people have said, it breathes oxygen into Bond fandom. I try not to spend too much time on Facebook, but I've seen some people post about this book and saying it's woke Bond, whatever the heck that means. Always, as soon as someone uses that term, just tell them to try and define what it means and then watch them flounder. It's one of my favorite things to do. But if you were to lay this out into, and say, oh, there's a female 00, there's a black gay 00, there's a Muslim 00, it does sound like box ticking in terms of diversity and inclusion, which I hate. I hate that kind of tokenism. Anyone who reads this book, I don't think, whether you enjoy the book or not, I don't think anyone could hand on heart say that this is box ticking diversity and inclusion. It's not that. This is just reflecting the world the way it is. All of our workplace, certainly my workplaces, that's what we have. We don't have 00s, unfortunately.
I'm sorry.
But, we do have women in senior positions. I work for a woman, I know, shocking, a woman.
Gosh, whatever next.
We do have black gay people. We do have Muslims in senior positions. We do, and so forth. It is just the world that exists, everybody. So why shouldn't James Bond reflect the world that we all live in, or at least the world that I'm familiar with? But probably the most exciting thing, and Terrance has just said it as well, he's really excited to see how this develops. Yes, A Spy Like Me will deal with the world that's been set up. We will have new characters, we will have new scenarios, but also the new innovations. I mean, this is such a nerdy thing, I know, for someone with I've got an English language and literature background myself and an education background, but A Spy Like Me, if you've read the preview in the paperback version of Double or Nothing, you've got an early chapter, if not the first chapter of A Spy Like Me, and it's written in the present tense. I know that sounds really noodly and really geeky, but we've never ever had a James Bond story written in the present tense before. And you read it and you think, why have we never had a James Bond story written in the present tense? If anyone's ever tried to write a story in the present tense, it's really flipping difficult to sustain the present tense throughout an omnisciently narrated story of any kind, let alone a novel length thing. I've tried it a few times and I've always come a cropper. But it lends the narrative such immediacy, and we already know A Spy Like Me is going to be set over a period of 6 days. It's one of those great time-locked adventures like Tomorrow Never Dies, all those others, which, it's like we have an ultimatum essentially to work towards. So that's what the second book's going to be. We don't have that until next April. What's the third book going to be? how else is it going
That's-
to develop? And that big question mark about how this is going to develop is the thing that personally I find most exciting.
So with that teaser chapter that we have in the paperback, because they were going to send me the paperback until they realized I was in the States, and they were like, "Oh, we can't do that." Like, okay, thanks, but I guess I'll wait. So tell me about that chapter if you don't mind. I mean, was it not with spoilers, but I mean the writing style, as you're talking about this present tense, is it a challenge? Is it one of those things where you're sitting there going, whoa, this was done so well?
I would say so. I mean, Roland's probably more qualified to comment on it. You know, he makes his living by actually writing. But the fact that we've got a sentence, I don't think it's too much of a spoiler, but it starts off in London Tuesday. I think it is the first chapter of the new book. Moneypenny's worst fear is not being on time. It keeps her up at night. That is the head of the 00 section. She might have before her the cogs, the wheels, the pins, and yet fail to visualize the whole machine. At 1:25 p.m., a bomb will explode at BBC New Broadcasting House.
That's a great first line.
I'm not going to say anything more. But that whole first chapter is about the potential bombing of the BBC, and it all unfolds in the present tense.
If you compare that to the opening page of Double or Nothing, I think it shows that we're in for a different experience, because that's a killer hook.
Very different. And that goes back to what I think most of us have said is the stage is set. She can open up now. She can start diving into these fresh new things it takes, because she doesn't have to spend the first 5 chapters telling us, giving us all the details of who everybody is in the book. Wonderful. Well, thank you for sharing that, David. I appreciate that. Guys, I do want to thank everybody for being here today. Guys, at home, if you're watching this, thanks for sticking with us. I know we've been on here for a little while now. Hope you get a chance to check out Kim Sherwood's Double or Nothing. You can find it pretty much anywhere you can find books at this point. There's, of course, the digital versions on Amazon as well. Let me know down in the comments, was this book for you?
If you enjoyed today's video, please consider subscribing. I always appreciate a thumbs up. Thanks so much for watching, and as always,